Welcome to the deep dive. We've got some really thought-provoking material you've shared. And what's kind of jumping out as we look through is this recurring idea of differences and gaps,
Or DaGs, yeah, as the sources often call them.
right? DaGs. So think of this as us, zeroing in on why things aren't always the same, how we perform, what we expect, the resources we actually have, or, well, the outcomes we get.
And maybe more importantly, why understanding these variations, why it actually matters. It gives you a useful way to look at things.
Exactly. We're planning to tackle this from both a big...
That's the one. Now, it's really easy to think, oh, system two, that's the best way. Always analyze, be deliberate. But what the sources point out is that system one isn't inherently bad. It can be incredibly useful.
Like an expert just knowing what to do.
Exactly. Or reacting in an emergency. You don't have time for system two then. And sometimes actually overthinking with system two can just, well, muddy the waters.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. It's interesting how we tend to look back, isn't it? If something went wrong.
Yeah.
I relied too much on instinct. Classic system one mistake.
Yeah.
Or if it went well, yep, that was my careful system two planning.
Right. We create this narrative afterwards, but the material suggests it's really not that simple. It's not about one being superior. It's more about recognizing which system is likely, in the driving seat at any given moment.
Got it. So different ways of thinking. And that kind of sets the stage for what the sources call VEDIs, longitudinal variabilities and disparities.
Yes, VEDIs. That's within one person over time. Think about it how you approach a task Monday morning versus, say, Friday afternoon. Your energy levels, your dominant thinking mode. It could be totally different. Different approach, maybe different outcome.
Okay, that makes sense. And then there are the cross-sectional VEDIs.
Right. That's just looking at different people at the same time in the same situation.
Okay.
10 people, you might get 10 slightly different ways of tackling the same problem. Different cognitive styles, different experiences.
Yeah, you see that constantly in teams, don't you?
Yeah.
Everyone brings their own perspective.
Mhm.
Now, the material also mentions observable and unobservable VEDIs. Something about different kinds of energy.
Uh-huh. Material energy like your physical state, rested or tired. And immaterial energy, your mental state, emotions, focus.
Seems pretty obvious when you state it like that. No two people are ever in the exact same physical and mental state, are they?
Pretty much impossible. And these energies are constantly interacting. Which brings us to another type of VEDI, objectives, outputs, outcomes, VEDIs. And they use cognitive dissonance as a key example here. When someone believes one thing but does another.
Right, that internal clash.
Exactly. That gap between the aim, consistency, the action, and the resulting feeling. That dissonance, it can even make them question their original belief. It shows how gaps can pop up anywhere in the process.
So from setting a goal to the final result, things can always go a bit off script.
Yeah.
And we usually think of these DaGs, these variations, as negative,
Yeah.
right? Mistakes, biases, that dissonance.
We often do, yeah. But the material makes a really critical point. These differences, these V's and DaGs, they're actually essential for progress, for innovation.
How so?
Well, think about it. If everything was always the same, if everyone thought and acted identically, where would new ideas come from? Cognition, our very thinking process, seems to grow by spotting and processing differences. Without VEDAs, you'd just have stagnation.
That's a really interesting perspective. So our senses are picking up these variations.
Constantly. Detecting DaGs, really. Then our internal immaterial energy kicks in. It compares what we're sensing now to our existing mental models, our expectations based on the past.
And if there's a mismatch.
That's a post-pre difference. And the difference is big enough, if it crosses our personal sort of tolerance threshold, then it becomes a post-pre gap.
Okay, so a difference is just a variation. But a gap is when that variation feels significant to us. And it sounds like we mostly understand these looking back.
Largely, yes. Hindsight is key. The sources distinguish between differences, more qualitative things like team skills or leadership style, and gaps, which are more quantitative, like being over budget or past a deadline.
And even when we try to plan for them, with buffers or backup plans.
Those plans are still based on assumptions, right? Assumptions about energy exchange, about objectives. It's when reality deviates from those assumptions that new DaGs are revealed.
Makes sense. And our immaterial energy, our internal state, that's what judges these DaGs. Decides they're good, bad, important.
Precisely. It assesses them against our mental models, assigns value, and drives our response. And crucially, what looks like a positive gap for one person,
Like getting that promotion.
right, can easily be a negative gap for someone else who missed out. It's all relative.
Okay, so these DaGs aren't isolated. They fit into a bigger picture. Which leads us, I guess, to the macro level, the individual and their environment.
Exactly. Figure 16.1 in the material conceptually shows this interplay. Our material energy, cognitive energy, affective energy, all interacting within our environment. And the environment itself is variable. It places demands on us.
And whether those demands create DaGs depends on our internal energy states at that moment.
Spot on. Let's break down those states. Material energy state, MES, and cognitive energy state, CES. The sources talk about quantity, quality, and accessibility for both.
Give me an example.
Okay. You could have tons of information, high quantity CES, but if you have no idea how to use it, low quality or accessibility, it's not much help.
Or being physically strong, high quantity MES, but completely exhausted, low accessibility.
Exactly. So the energy state's DAG is just the mismatch between the energy you have available and the energy the situation needs. Surplus is positive, deficit is negative.
A positive DaG gives you a buffer. A negative one means you're likely going to struggle.
Pretty much. But it's not always simple addition, is it? Because then there's the balanced usable energy state, or UES.
Right. How does that work?
It's about the interaction. Sometimes, like being really mentally sharp, having high CES can help you compensate if you're physically tired, maybe lower MES. You push through.
But if both are low,
Then you've got a significant negative UES stack. You're running on empty, basically.
and that's where external support comes in.
Yes. Material support, better tools, help from colleagues reduces the physical load. Cognitive support, clearer information, maybe automation eases the mental load. Both can shrink negative DAGs and boost your UES.
Okay, so zooming out even further, there's the overall energy state, OES. This sounds like the whole shebang.
It is. It depends on that constant dance between MES, CES, and effective energy balance, AEB, which is basically your emotional state.
And influenced by context, existing DAGs, urgency, even unspoken goals.
All of it feeds in. And when that OES DAG is really negative, demands just swamp your usable energy. What happens?
You just react, survival mode.
Pretty much. You focus on the immediate who, what, where, when, how. Less mental space for the why. The firefighter example in the text is perfect. They're focused on doing, using trained responses and available info, not theorizing about combustion.
Makes total sense. You rely on instinct and training. And support needs to be right, too, giving that firefighter more water.
Helps. But trying to teach them a complex new gadget mid-fire probably makes things worse. Timing and suitability of support are key.
On the flip side, if you have neutral or positive DAGs, more energy than needed.
Then you have bandwidth. You can reflect, question things, maybe even work on self-transformation. The sources mention self-development stuff here. But there's a catch.
Which is?
You actually have to want to change or reflect. The capacity is there, but the drive needs to be too.
So these DAGs aren't just snapshots. They influence our potential to learn and grow. It also explains why getting exactly the same performance every time is, well, unrealistic.
Absolutely. Too many variables interacting. You know, we hear stories about people overcoming huge negative DAGs, massive challenges.
True heroes.
But we also see the opposite. Situations where everything looks fine, resources seem adequate, but things still go wrong.
Yeah. And it's a cycle, isn't it? Every exchange, every DAG, it feeds back, changes our associations, our emotions, maybe even our physical resilience.
And it affects others, the whole context. Table 16.1 in the materials sums up these macro implications well. Things like people having different energy thresholds, responding differently to help, energy levels changing over time.
And the difficulty of measuring cognitive or affective energy precisely. So knowing exactly what support is needed is tricky.
Right, and the need for trust when sharing these experiences and having support readily available.
Okay, that paints a clear picture of the macro level. Now let's drill down. The micro level inside the brain.
Exactly. Internal DAGs. Figure 16.2 gives a conceptual model. It shows material energy coming in, getting translated into data, then information via cognitive and affective energies, leading to sensed events that modify the context. It's simplified, of course. Lots happens in parallel.
But it gives us a framework. What are the main stages they outline?
Okay, first, data reception through the senses. Then perception, which leads to building a situation model. Then comprehension, comparing that model to what we already know, our cognitive associations.
Okay.
Then comparing possible responses or actions. Then actually executing the chosen action, which is shaped by both cognitive and affective energy. And finally, verification, updating our internal models based on what happened. The sensed events, the DAGs versus our objectives.
And that feeds back.
Yeah, feedback loops all over. Sensed events transmit energy back to us and the environment.
So where do the internal gaps come in this micro model?
The material points to three main areas. First, that outer green circle in the diagram represents presumptive DaGs, basically. The mismatch between our assumptions about our energy and the context and the reality. Macro-level stuff impacting internally.
Right.
Then, the red DaGs. That's the gap between our usable energy and the energy we actually invest in a task, material, and cognitive.
And the blue ones.
Those are about objectives aimed for versus objectives achieved. Quantity, quality, timing. Did we hit the target?
Trying to put numbers on those red or blue internal gaps sounds impossible.
Highly impractical, yeah. Too many goals at once, shifting energy, changing environments. But looking back at the macro model, figure 16.1 can help identify areas where we can maybe manage things better to minimize those internal DaGs.
Now, running through all this are these affective criteria, the dashed lines in the diagram, stemming from our motivation and willful energy investment.
Exactly. These aren't logical steps so much as emotional influences on our energy. The first one is the filtering criterion.
Okay, what's that?
It's the very first affective reaction to sensory input. It can trigger an automatic action or inaction.
Like pulling your hand from heat, a reflex.
Precisely. Or maybe just ignoring something, filtering it out. Or it lets the data pass for more cognitive processing. Neuroscience and cognitive psychology look at these fast reactions. The sources link them to affective energy, especially those innate, hardwired responses.
Makes sense. What's next?
The trust criterion. If data gets past the initial filter, we then sort of subconsciously assess its credibility. Do we trust this perception? If not...
We might ignore it or go looking for more info.
Exactly. It could restart the whole cycle.
Yeah.
Then comes the intervention criterion.
Intervention. Deciding whether to act.
Basically, yeah. Based on past action event links stored in memory and our current emotional balance, we decide whether to intervene or not. And remember, not acting is still considered a sensed event in this model.
Okay. And if we decide to act, but there's more than one way.
That brings in the suitability criterion. Cognitive and affective interplay here. We weigh the options, consider the effects on ourselves, on others, select the preferred strategy. But if we can't decide...
I might freeze, do nothing.
It's possible, yeah. Indecision leads to inaction. And finally, the optimization criterion.
Optimization. How we do the action.
How our immaterial energy shapes the execution to meet the objectives efficiently, maybe using extra resources. If we feel we can't do it optimally.
We might again choose inaction. Or maybe a less optimal action.
Could be either. It's about that perceived ability to achieve the aims effectively.
Wow. That's a lot going on internally. This whole deep dive into differences and gaps has been really, really illuminating.
It provides a pretty comprehensive framework, doesn't it?
It really does. And wrapping it up, the material's key reflections and actions section seems to pull it all together. Recognizing DaGs macro and micro, understanding energy interactions, using positive gaps, tackling negative ones, balancing demands, and just talking about it openly.
Absolutely. That open dialogue is key for constructive problem solving. It helps see these variations not as failures, but as inherent parts of how we operate and interact.
So thinking about all this, reflecting on your own experiences, can you maybe pinpoint times where understanding this interplay material, cognitive, affective energy, macro and micro DaGs, might have led you down a different path in a tricky situation, maybe change the outcome?
It's a useful exercise for anyone, I think, and maybe also consciously noticing System 1 and System 2 thinking day to day. When is each one dominant? How does that affect perception, action, especially when things don't go as expected, when those gaps appear?
Yeah, and thinking about those affective criteria too. Filtering, trust, intervention, suitability, optimization. How much are they unconsciously steering our responses and decisions? Could being more aware lead to more, intentional choices?
It's definitely food for thought. Ultimately, I think by getting a handle on these dynamics of differences and gaps, the way we've explored them here, you really do gain a valuable lens for navigating, well, everything. Professional life, personal life. It gives you insight, maybe more adaptability,